Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here, and we're looking forward to a great panel on the way forward for the international IP system. Trade agreements have long been a really critical vehicle for advancing intellectual property reform and progress worldwide. And today, some see trade agreements as a more challenging path and see value in also considering other ways forward. Is that a correct view? And what are these other promising ways forward? And what's the right mix of tools? We have a very distinguished panel to help us answer these questions and others. Thought leaders from both academia and the private sector. And I'll just briefly introduce our panel here. Mark Schultz, to my left, is the founder of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property here at George Mason, also a professor of law at Southern Illinois University. Nigel Corey is a trade policy analyst with ITIF, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He previously served with the Australian Foreign Service. George York is Senior Vice President for International Policy at the Recording Industry Association of America and a former intellectual property trade negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And Becky Frazier is Director of International Government Affairs at Qualcomm. Prior to joining Qualcomm, she had a distinguished career at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, focusing on China policy and on Capitol Hill. Nigel and Mark are both conducting research related to our topic today and will share some early insights from their work. And then George and Becky will comment on those presentations and share some of their views. And then we'll open the floor to your questions. So we're going to turn first to Nigel Corey. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here to talk about what is a very interesting but challenging issue, the way ahead for intellectual property internationally. In contrast to the last panel, I'll be adding a heavy dose of trade and economic policy, which is obviously not proven controversial at all in recent times. Regardless, it's an important topic as there is a very real race to there's a very real global race for innovation advantage, which obviously involves and based around ideas, technology and knowledge, obviously each of which are tied closely to intellectual property. The central tenet of my presentation and my forthcoming paper, which I'm doing with my colleague Stephen Ezell, is that the world needs more, not less innovation, that intellectual property is crucial to facilitating this, that the world's leading innovating countries, the United States, the European Union, Japan and others, need to be better coordinated, set a clearer objective and show greater leadership in defending intellectual property and working together to drive a constructive agenda looking ahead. When I talk of innovation, what I'm talking about, just quickly, is the improvement of existing processes or the creation of entirely new sort of goods, services, processes and organisational or business models. Innovation is it's a central part of our paper because it drives long-term economic growth and improves standards of living. For example, the US Department of Commerce released a report in 2010 that showed that technological innovation can be tied to over 2/3 of the economic growth in the US since World War II. Innovation is central to the competitive advantage of today's truly innovative enterprises and sectors, as these sectors aren't focused on producing sort of goods and services, current goods and services more cheaply, but on developing the next generation. Strong and enforceable IP rights are obviously essential for these sectors. So in looking ahead, we just need to keep that goal in mind in terms of how do we maximise innovation. However, in looking at the way ahead for IP internationally, it's impossible not to look to the past and the divisive ideological battle that currently defines IP internationally. Fundamentally, this is a battle over ideas. It's not a new battle, but it's certainly intensified since the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS. The battle includes those who innovate and create and those who would free ride. It focuses on the gap between the economic value of goods and services distributed in a low cost of infringement. At one end are stakeholders who engage in the debate on how rights, limitations and exceptions in intellectual property should be balanced, but based around a shared understanding that intellectual property is a critical sort of enabler in the innovation framework. At the other end are strident ideological opponents, whether it be individuals or public interest and advocacy groups, who seek to weaken or sever the connection between IP and innovation and trade. You see this in calls for moratoriums on new global rules on IP, or efforts to weaken current domestic or international laws through unreasonably expanded limitations and exceptions in the international arena. Distributional impacts in developing countries mean that many of these opponents will oppose any and all efforts to sort of strengthen IP internationally, whatever their inventive effects. Internet exceptionalists adamantly oppose the application of copyright online, which exists offline. As it relates to trade, these opponents seek to sever the connection by claiming IP provisions are behind the border and therefore irrelevant to trade, and that such provisions sort of infringe on state sovereignty and a state's right to sort of do whatever they please with IP, typically in the context of an agenda that looks to state-directed sort of industrial policy. These arguments are often tied to a broader and deeper opposition to globalisation and the established role of IP and free trade and large corporations. This is what we saw in the hyperbole and the outrage around the IP chapter with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, and I imagine it's what we'll see with the ongoing NAFTA negotiations. But just as critical in this debate is that these opponents have been successful in framing the current debate around their goals to undermine or remove intellectual property in order to allow immediate access to technologies at below market or free, sort of in terms of free access, and the forced redistribution of these technologies. This framing distracts from the impact this policy would have on innovation in the long term, and also distracts from the policies and efforts that would go into helping countries actually enact the framework to help with the adoption, the deployment and absorption of new technologies. What's at stake in this debate as we talk about IP internationally is an essential enabling condition for trade and innovation. Global trade flows are increasingly dominated by knowledge-intensive goods and services, which are growing faster than labour and capital-intensive flows. As ITIF has argued in past work, how each country develops its own framework for innovation, including IP, determines whether the country ultimately contributes to or detracts from global innovation. What we see in this debate is an effect in that the lack of stronger IP and better enforcement mechanisms undermines our ability to maximise global innovation, as it allows countries to turn to beggar thy neighbour innovation mercantilism, as we call it, which is a strategy to use protectionist and trade distorting measures that tip the market scales in favour of domestic technology production. These tactics include purposely weak IP rules and enforcement, forcing companies to transfer IP and technology as a condition of market entry, or just the outright theft of IP. The impact of this debate and this strategy could undermine sort of not just current business practices and intellectual property, but the new networks and ways in which companies are arranging production and innovation sort of globally through global value chains and global innovation networks. Both networks are related to increasing specialisation, as decreasing transport and technology costs and increasing technological capabilities enable companies to sort of unbundle services, production and ideas from geography. Global innovation networks are emerging as companies find new ways to sort of form, to develop their innovative sort of products and services by sort of working with different companies and setting up sort of new R&D relationships, collaborative sort of partnerships across different countries along a single production line. Indicative of these networks is the rise of international sort of co-inventions. So what are some ideas in this context on the way ahead? Firstly, the United States, the European Union, Japan and other countries that sort of recognise and appreciate the role of IP within the innovation framework need to renew and step up their individual and collective efforts to protect IP rules wherever they're debated. whether these are in international organisations, conferences or related projects or studies. Such an all-points strategy, as we call it in the paper, would simply reflect the fact that the opponents of intellectual property are pursuing a similar strategy, but obviously with the very opposite sort of objectives. Opponents of strong IP have the advantage, though, of a very simple and appealing message that cutting-edge innovations should be free. This type of message is appearing in debates around health, education, the environment and other issues that involve applying technology to current public policy issues. We're seeing this appear in a growing range of international forums, often with participants who don't need to consider the context of IP sort of in the broader economic area. IP for them may not even be part of sort of their organisation's mandate or their typical agenda. A very clear example of this is the United Nations High-Level Panel on Access to Medicines, set up by former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. The UNHLP focused exclusively on IP as if patent rights are a barrier to access to medicines, without looking at any number of the more serious parts of the issue. Instead, the guidance told them to look at the policy incoherence between IP rights, innovation and access to medicines. But that a United Nations panel should start at a point that is critical of IP shouldn't be surprising. There are any number of striking examples in the UN Conference on Trade and Development, the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Development Programme and any other number of international sort of UN bodies. While the outcome of these discussions may not always be binding or exciting, it may result in a report or statement which may not need consensus and therefore can reflect a very narrow view, which can cascade by referring to other similar statements and thus reinforcing their perspective while adding legitimacy to it. An additional focus point in this all-point strategy should be multilateral and regional development banks, as they play a crucial role in advocating sort of framework factors for innovation and IP. In terms of non-trade agreement cooperation, another idea is for the United States, the European Union, Japan and other like-mindeds, stepping up their individual and collective engagement with the growing range of countries which recognise sort of IP and innovation as a crucial objective, as they recognise that link between the two. A key part of this could be greater engagement and leadership by respective countries' sort of intellectual property agencies with developing countries who are genuinely interested in improving their innovation ecosystem and using IP in that way. This would complement and extend, obviously, sort of similar work that WIPO already does in this regard. This type of cooperation is already happening to a degree. There is engagement between the 5 IP offices of the United States, China, Japan, Korea and the European Union. In a similar way, ITIF is tapping into this same sort of growing interest in a growing sort of variety of countries in innovation and IP, having set up a global network of 19 think tanks in developed and developing countries who work together around a similar and shared set of principles on trade and innovation, which leaves us with the way ahead for using international trade agreements. The stalemate, while trade policy is obviously undergoing a period of upheaval at the moment, the need for new and binding rules on IP and the enforcement of IP obviously remains. The stalemate at the multilateral level means that the international framework, the gap between the international framework, which is mainly set by TRIPS, and sort of current technology and business practices continues to grow. An idea perhaps that we will propose in the paper is that the world's leading innovating countries and those countries that aspire to adapt to the changing nature of production and innovation can consider a slightly different and more specialised approach to identifying and negotiating innovation agreements alongside complementary efforts on sort of building capacity and sharing of best practices. The traditional structure of trade agreements could be disaggregated to focus on innovation-specific measures, some of which obviously feature as a part of recent trade agreements, but there are many outstanding areas for progress, such as addressing service market access commitments, the free flow of data, the movement of highly skilled professionals, and obviously intellectual property. Negotiating agreements on network or sector-specific issues could also send a signal to other firms in this area that the sort of countries involved in this are interested in playing a bigger role. and that they're committed to putting in place the policies to support this. And in this way, it would build on the research that we've already seen of how trade policy and traditional trade agreements, by reducing or eliminating tariffs, have supported the shaping of global value chains. And innovation, in summary, just as post-World War II trade agreements aimed at facilitating access to foreign markets for physical goods with the aim of maximising comparative and competitive advantage, so these sets of ideas would seek to do this for services and knowledge-intensive goods, but with the obvious objective of maximising innovation. It's not about north or south anymore. A traditional sort of framework for looking at IP internationally. It's about whether you live in a country whose policymakers get that IP rights are beneficial for innovation and economic growth or not. The ideas are based on obviously some degree of continuity with current trade policy, obviously with some new angles. In this way, it reflects a level of pragmatism in that it would target countries that recognise that TRIPS represents a floor, not a ceiling, that for IP protection, and who recognise that updates are necessary, and that the framework factors around IP deserve more attention in order to allow countries to maximise the benefits of intellectual property. It also recognises the need to move around the current stalemate at the multilateral level, to not allow the ideological anchoring to hold back efforts to build an international framework for IP that better supports global innovation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Lots of great food for thought there. I want to turn next to Mark Schultz to continue the conversation.
Thank you. And thanks to Nigel for not only an excellent talk, but one that's quite complimentary, so I'll adopt his remarks by reference, and it'll allow me to skip saying a few things. And so my proposal, which I'll be discussing, is the use of voluntary dialogues on best practices in drafting and implementing national laws as a way forward, And before I get started, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this piece, Deborah Wagner, who's here, and Roy Camphausen particularly, because it's really their idea and their leadership that, with respect to the trade secrets dialogue that we've been working on together, that has inspired this discussion. Okay, so my motivation for this proposal is that, as Nigel has discussed, it's become much more challenging to improve ICP systems globally through trade agreements and treaties. It's not impossible anymore. It's become more challenging for reasons I'll discuss momentarily. And so our proposal is that a complementary way forward, and sometimes an alternative way forward, would be to have voluntary dialogues among like-minded countries, which reflects something Nigel discussed, to establish detailed principles and guidelines, best practices for improving national laws. So I'll be talking about the current state of international IP policy that motivates this proposal. I'll be talking about the proposal generally, and I'll be illustrating it through the example of a voluntary best practices dialogue on improving trade secret laws globally, a dialogue that we have already launched among the co-authors and the co-authors' organizations. Okay. So I think there's two issues with the current state of international IP policy. And they both stem from, in some respects, the brilliant tactical move of tying intellectual property rights improvements to trade that is embodied in the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement, for the first time, really brought the world together and required everybody who signed on to TRIPS, which is most nations in the world, to implement in their laws minimum standards of IP protection. And TRIPS is an agreement that has teeth. maybe not as, the teeth aren't as sharp as people may have thought initially, but it certainly is an agreement that encourages people through its enforcement mechanisms to actually meet their commitments to improving their laws. And we've had, of course, other bilateral trade agreements and recently attempts at multilateral trade agreements outside of the WTO that also tie IP to trade. And to some extent, we've reached perhaps we've reached the peak of this strategy, because today, I think we're in a place where the trade IP tide has, to some extent, become a victim of its own success. We're addressing new challenges, and we also are finding that there are next steps we need to take that naturally go beyond what you can do in trade agreements, because trade agreements have taken us so far. And the other thing we have to acknowledge is that, at least in the current climate, the trade IP tide is increasingly a challenging platform, as Nigel described, for many reasons. Okay, to describe some of the new challenges we face that are motivating this proposal. We have new technology and new actors who've vastly increased the nature and scope of some types of IP infringement. Digital infringement, the ability to use network communications and digital files has, of course, greatly disrupted the creative industries, has greatly reduced their prospects in some respects. But it's also been a challenge for trade secret owners, right? It's easier to infringe trade secrets than it was in the past. In the past, it would have required, making hundreds and thousands of photocopies, and now an employee can walk out with a thumb drive full of trade secrets, or indeed transmit them over the internet. And also, some new challenges we face are just in the nature of the changing business climate and political climate. And some of this is a result of the success of the WTO and TRIPS. Business is more global than ever. IP is more valuable than ever. And thus, the nature and importance of the challenge is greater, and sometimes the debates are thus that much more contentious. I think even more important in terms of a best practices dialogue is that we face some next step challenges, I call them. Things that you can't really do well in a trade agreement, because they demand things that a trade agreement can't always do. We have administration and capacity building issues. You can tell a country what it has to do, but it actually has to figure out how to do it. Similarly, we've reached the point where some of the biggest obstacles to effective IP systems aren't the sort of things you can write into substantive IP law. They're more a matter of things like evidentiary rules, how you get access to proof, what judges understand how to do, and that is challenging for countries. We have very different legal systems. We have common law systems in many countries. We have civil law systems in many countries. The way in which they handle pretrial access to proof is extremely different. And we're not going to get countries to change how they do those things for the sake of intellectual property laws. So somehow we need to discuss how, within existing frameworks, within existing legal traditions, what are the best ways to foster effective IP protection. Just an example on the administration issue, we did a white paper last year on how long it takes on average to get a patent granted in a sample of countries. And what we found, for example, were some pretty surprising statistics. Maybe some of you won't be surprised, but on average, the average patent application granted in Thailand and Brazil, for example, was 10 years old on average. And in specific technology categories, you find things like pharmaceutical patents, on average, were 14 years old. The applications were 14 years old when granted in Thailand. In other categories of technology, in Brazil and Thailand and India, you find similarly long waits for some of the most important tech sectors of the day. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us we have problems that can't be fixed easily in treaties. You can tell a country that it should provide patents in particular categories, as TRIPS does. You could even tell them they must expediently grant patents, but you can't tell them how to do it and how to run an effective IP office. And so this is an example of one of the limitations of trade agreements. One of the other challenges to the IP trade, I think Nigel covered well. And although I would point to some additional issues of some additional difficulties. One is that as soon as we made IP part of the trade agenda, which, as I said, was brilliant, was a brilliant tactical move, what we also did is we made it a bargaining chip. Right? It's no longer a tool for local development. It's something that you need to withhold, because if you give in on it, you're giving away something you could have bargained for another trade concession. And at least in some of the discussions around NAFTA, I've heard exactly this, that Canada and Mexico consider the IP chapter, or at least they've so stated, I've been told, that the IP chapter is the US thing. It's the thing we want and need. And so, if we want something there, we need to give them something elsewhere in other chapters. That's an example of that kind of zero-sum game thinking that makes it harder to advance IP systems. The other thing Nigel talked about well, right? When TRIPS has created its own vast infrastructure of opposition that tends to throw sand in the gears and makes advancing IP through trade agreements more difficult. And then, as everybody in the room understands, trade agreements are now more controversial and thus a less effective vehicle than when they were more universally embraced 20 years ago. So, what do? Well, one of the proposals here, our proposal, is that it may be time to talk. And I'll talk about the value of talk. Our proposal is to bring together groups of like-minded nations that believe in strong IP rights, want to explore more effective protection, and bring them together to have serious discussions about best practices in drafting and implementing laws, and to learn from one another. And I'll give you an example within the context of the trade secret dialogue. There are promising precedents for this. For example, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, recently issued best practices on trade secrets, which are a good start. They fit on about 3 PowerPoint slides, so they're not detailed enough, but they're a good start. And what I think one advantage of a voluntary dialogue is it can also serve as something on which to base later progress on. We need to find some new solutions to our problems rather than, trying to, continue to progress on some solutions that are 20 years old, say in the copyright area, such as notice and takedown, for example. Maybe there's something new we could develop. Okay, the example I want to provide is in the area of trade secrets, as I've promised. And in trade secret law, what we found globally, and what I worked with a co-author to demonstrate a few years ago, is that indeed trade secret laws have become stronger globally because of TRIPS in large part, and because of the desire of countries to have stronger and more effective trade secret laws. But one problem is an effective trade secret law to work requires more than just minimum standards. For example, a couple of issues that are really important in a trade secret law are access to proof. Often, by its nature, information about trade secrets is capable of being hidden. And it's often the potential defendant, who has the best information on whether trade secrets have been misappropriated and what's been done with them. And in that case, you need pretrial access to proof. But the difficulty with the discussion, of course, is that we're never going to persuade the rest of the world to adopt the US discovery system. They think we're insane. But there still needs to be some way in civil law countries, for example, where there is no pretrial access to proof. I'm not making that as a general statement. In some civil law countries, there's essentially no pretrial access to proof. You need to find other ways to achieve that goal of pretrial proof, pretrial access, and some civil law systems do it. Another issue is secrecy during litigation. Often trade secrets that are litigated are imperiled further through litigation. And this is something that is often a matter of capacity building in courts. Many courts don't understand how to do this well and need help doing so. So how would this work? Well, what we're advocating and what we've started, what we did a practice run essentially last December, is to bring together groups of experts, convened among willing governments, to have a discussion of a particular issue in depth. These detailed discussions could result in non-binding detailed reports, and the non-binding detailed reports can later serve as the basis for encouraging the drafting of improved national legislation, for capacity building, and perhaps for later agreements. Now, as I said, this isn't the sexiest proposal. I know, let's talk more. Isn't that exciting? But talking more at this point is useful because we already have TRIPS. We have minimum standards. We've achieved that. But what we don't always have is countries that know what to do with those minimum standards. I was at a WIPO workshop in Singapore 2 weeks ago. Thailand was talking about its trade secret law. They said, yes, we've implemented this trade secret law, but by the way, the courts have denied every claim. They've dismissed every claim that's been brought because they're imposing very high standards of evidence and pleading that can't be met without pretrial access to proof, which isn't available in these cases, at least the way the Thai system has configured the cases. So this is the sort of example of what we need to do to move forward and the impetus for it, and that's what we're advocating. So thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. I want to turn now to George and Becky. And George, I'll go to you first. We've just heard, I think, that perhaps we've reached peak trade agreement around the world. Maybe the white flag is halfway up the pole. We've heard that advancing intellectual property rights protections through these types of comprehensive deals is suddenly harder. Perhaps we need to be looking at separate innovation agreements or best practice dialogues. Wonder if that assessment is maybe a little bit too hasty and whether we really need to be continuing to focus on these types of comprehensive deals, perhaps along with some of the other alternatives. Over to you.
Many thanks to Chris, and thanks to Nigel and Mark for their excellent presentations. Thanks also to CPIP for being such a continued leader in IP thought and education. And also thanks to George Mason. We had a round in TTIP here, I think, last year or 2 years ago. It brings back nightmarish memories, but it's good to be back on campus again. And had I been at USTR, I might be in a basement in the Sheraton Pentagon right now. So I'm so happy to have a window in this room. So that's super helpful. So I want to, I guess, basically fundamentally question the premise of the previous two speakers in the most diplomatic way I can. First, I think the idea that trade is hard is not new. All you have to do is go back to look at the International Trade Organization that was supposed to go with the World Bank and the Bretton Woods system and see out of that collapse rose like the phoenix, the WTO. Right, the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's signature effort didn't do so well here in our Congress, but out of that came the United Nations. And not that that's an exemplar necessarily of functional multilateralism. I would say that this is not a new concept. And in fact, for me, it's a reason why we have to double down on these issues. Trade is challenging. It's challenging because it's vital, it's critical. And so I share Nigel and Mark's assessment of why IP is a trade issue, why it's so important to driving growth, competitiveness, job creation, all of these issues. I think we agree on that, but though it's the means to get to those ends, I think that's very helpful. Nigel, I wanted to also thank you for your rhetorical flourishes. I liked in your essay the howls of outrage and hyperbole, and I was wondering, would that include RIAA or not? So I'll try to avoid that. But sometimes I think straw men are created. You referred to the strident ideological components talking about, gee whiz, fair use and safe harbors are bad in TPP, but surely fair use and TPP versions of safe harbors are good, right? Well, we're going to examine that a little more closely, always. But I appreciate you raising those. So first, trade agreements, that transactional nature of trade agreements, I think is what allows some of those dialogues that have occurred in trade fora and other dialogues to actually be implemented in a real way, in a way that creates concrete results, hopefully with dispute settlement attached. So I agree that should be an all points or a multi-track approach, but you have to think, let's not think parallel, distinct channels, but let's think along a synchronized sort of whole tactical and strategic approach. So I think we also have to know that if we're not doing trade agreements, other people are, and they're doing them in ways that disadvantage rights holders, that disadvantage American users, workers, labor, business, et cetera. So RCEP right now is stalled, but that's the trade agreement of the Special 301 priority watch list countries. And so that's always challenging, obviously. The balance provision in TPP made its way into RCEP, which is always a good sign that that's a bad idea. So things like that, they're happening, right? RCEP, the EU is out minting trade agreements. And if any of you have had the misfortune of dealing with geographical indications, which somehow cheese has become an IP issue, you'll know that the EU is out there minting trade agreements that are adverse to our interests here. So if we're not doing it, they are. And sometimes they're doing it in ways that advance our goals, if we're lucky. Most of the time, that's not the case. Likewise, I think that there has to be coordination. So I completely agree that dialogue is important. You've mentioned things like the Transatlantic IP Dialogue, which became the basis for TTIP, which became the basis for some innovative provisions. Again, not an exemplar of successful trade agreements. However, a lot of what's in there will then find its way into NAFTA, right? So sometimes trade agreements run into some challenges, but at the same time, they are successful. So if I had to identify some things that would be part of a multi-track trade approach, obviously trade agreements would have to be part of that. But I would say that there's sort of three distinct elements that I would really stress. First, engagement. We have to be engaged. The United States has to be engaged in all of these fora. We have to pay our WIPO dues. We have to be engaged in the WTO. We have to be engaged in MOUs, FTAs, bilaterals, regional. You know, there are organizations in Africa that represent Francophone and Anglophone speaking countries who have gone way beyond the TRIPS agreement. This is rarely ever discussed, but those are the kind of bodies who are being worked with WIPO. I think that was one of your ideas, Nigel. And I think that should be supported, so we have to be engaged. Second, do not assume monoliths, right? We can't assume that the BRIC countries are always aligned. When we were at the climate negotiations, that was not the case. One country who rhymes with Mindia would have a proposal, and then China would not necessarily agree with that. And that was because IP has become more important in their system, especially on clean tech and green tech products. Don't think that tech is a monolith. There are tech companies and there are tech companies and there are tech companies. An inclusive trade policy that includes creators who are digital, who are driving economic surplus, just a little plug for the music industry, are part of the tech community. So provisions about data flows and server localization, let's make sure that those don't end up being ways to circumvent good, strong copyright enforcement, for example. Also countries within countries, even countries where they take strident positions against IP, that's not always true at home, right? There's always IP agencies in those markets, and maybe they're working with other ministries that have a different position, but we should always be trying to develop those different voices, and that leads me to my third element of a multi-track strategy, which is develop those domestic champions. We should always be working, it's not always great to say how IP works for really big American companies, as important as that is, but how it works for folks in those markets. So trying to identify, as we did in India, clean tech creators who develop solar cells that are price effective, or how to develop water ATM cards, right? These are really important innovations that are IP backed, that helps send a message about the value of IP for promoting innovation and creativity. So those are a few quick responses to some of the good ideas that have been proposed so far.
George, thank you so much. Those are great comments and excellent contributions. Becky, wanted to turn to you as well. Technology is changing so quickly, and your company, Qualcomm, has really been at the forefront of a lot of the innovation. What kinds of tools and agreements do you think have really been critical and will be critical in building an understanding of the rules needed to drive and sustain innovation? And do you think that we're so far along in our conversations with different countries around the world about these new technologies and what's needed to support them, that we're actually running up against some of these next step challenges that Mark mentioned? Are we quite there yet with a lot of these things?
Well, let me start by thanking CPIP for convening today's session, and I'm delighted to be on this panel to provide a perspective on two very thought-provoking and interesting papers that Mark and Nigel have introduced. Not surprisingly, I find myself agreeing with much of what has been said so far. From a Qualcomm perspective, I think it's really important that the United States continue to explore all avenues of protecting intellectual property, and that includes the ideas that both Nigel and Mark have introduced. We need to simultaneously explore voluntary multilateral discussions that focus on topic-specific issues of countries that are willing and interested in coming to the table to talk about how they can strengthen their innovation ecosystems at home and the critical role that IP plays in that. We have to, at the same time, continue the discussion and the work. As George mentioned, trade is hard, but continuing the focus on enforceable intellectual property rights provisions in IP framework agreements and in our free trade agreements is critical. So pursuing these simultaneously and really continuing that push becomes incredibly important. And there's obviously a myriad of different options that are a hybrid of these two strategies. One thing that we often contemplate as potentially a productive conversation is to encourage a dialogue within the WTO TRIPS agreement where countries voluntarily bring their domestic IP laws to the table to have an analysis, a compare and contrast discussion about ways that certain elements could be improved because they are interested in having that type of technical assistance and that type of discussion. So that's the benefit of a voluntary self-selecting group that wants to improve, but then the baseline remains something that is enforceable and something that can be relied on as the intellectual property evolves. Second point regarding the timing that you mentioned, Chris, I think that we're at a really interesting nexus as this Trump administration is looking at revisiting free trade agreements. We really have an opportunity, first and foremost, with the North American Free Trade Agreement and with the Korean-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the KORUS, to really relook at how we can plus up some of the IP provisions and potentially make some changes as technology is evolving so fast. From our sector's perspective, we're looking at these free trade agreements and emerging technologies, and today's conversation about the way forward of the international IP system is cresting right at a time when you have really the introduction of some amazing new emerging technologies and how we capture the intellectual property that is going to be generated in these next generation technologies of artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, and ensure that there is the protection that's needed to continue to bring these technologies to the fora included in our free trade agreements and in our international IP dialogues globally. And that obviously involves the overlap of IP chapters and digital chapters and other relevant parts of free trade agreements and belts and suspenders approaches. But What we're also seeing as some of this emerging technology is really coming to the fore is that it's not just the big companies that are producing this. This very much is small and medium-sized companies. This very much is companies in different countries, given the global innovation ecosystems that exist today. And so, we're seeing, for example, Internet of Things, where there are a number of examples of where big traditional companies now have to know something about something they haven't had to before, right? Refrigerator manufacturers have to know how to install cameras, connect to the home hub. They have to connect to Wi-Fi. They need all of these different tools that they would have no reason of understanding prior, and that's a role that we are seeing a number of SMEs and other kind of the non-traditional players coming forward and bridging that gap and really creating the core expertise. And so we are at a point where we are seeing it's not just the large companies that are after this intellectual property protection as the technology changes, as we're on this forefront of the next industrial revolution. And so in closing, I would just underline that, again, we need to pursue a multi-pronged strategy of really, as intellectual property rights protectors and innovators, we need to continue to encourage the U.S. government and other countries and other stakeholders of a like mind that there are some really important conversations that need to be happening now to ensure that next generation technology is protected.
Thank you so much, Becky. We already have, I think, a pretty lively debate going within the panel on both where we are, but what we need to be looking at moving forward. Want to really open it up at this point and invite all of you to join the discussion and ask any questions, make any comments that you may have for the panel.
So my question's for Mr. Corey. You commented on the UN committee report on access to medicine and how it was anti-IP relative in its basic premise. The argument the people seem to consistently make supporting the goals of that committee are that applying IP protections to pharmaceuticals in developing countries is going to reduce demand for the products at the monopoly prices needed to drive innovation in a very small amount because there aren't people in those countries who can afford them. And as a result, the narrow goal of providing IP-free drugs to those countries doesn't impact the broader goals of IP policy, at least from a utilitarian basis. I didn't see you addressing that primary argument that's made against your position in your speech, and I wanted to know if you had a response to it, aside from the obvious possibility that the IP-free drugs end up bleeding out of that country into developed countries.
The central point I wanted to make as it relates to the access on panel to the UN access on affordable access to medicines is that it started from a premise that IP was the barrier to better health services in these countries, whereas health is improving healthcare is a far more complex task, and that there are a whole range of factors involved there, and that IP isn't the primary determinant of that. And so I wanted to use it as an example of the type of ideological opposition that you see springing up in these forums, and that its starting premise is obviously its main problem. The fact that the panel was formed even though the relevant international organisations that are responsible for these issues, that being the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Office, and the World Health Organization had jointly produced a report on that very issue before the panel was formed, is indicative of that concern about the panel sort of pursuing a very sort of select sort of analysis that's sort of starting from what we essentially from a false premise. So that was the primary point of what I was trying to get at there. there's obviously a very broad and wide-ranging debate about the role of IP and pharmaceuticals that's been going on for some time, and it's obviously sort of been a central focal point for TRIPS as well, and there's been obviously a lot of activity there. But I suppose what stands out to me there, and it sort of relates to the broader point I was trying to get, is that quite often what you see in the debate around IP and these public policy issues is that IP is unfairly targeted as the barrier to progress on issue X, when what is often involved is much harder and more complex issues involving the various systems and institutions and things involved there. And so what we too often run into is that organisations sort of putting IP as the barrier, as if it's an easy option, as if you remove it, suddenly sort of the problem is solved. That was my sort of overarching sort of point, sort of in using that panel as my example.
Thanks, Nigel. I think we had a hand up down here.
Good afternoon. I'm a graduate of this law school some 33 years ago, and so it's pretty heartwarming seeing something like this. It wasn't even called intellectual property back then. I think Mark's system will work. I've seen it work. I'm going to ask you a question and make you get specific, though. I saw it happen in the course of my career when we transplanted the U.S. patent system over to the Communist China, and their patent system is ours. And I knew a number of experts, like former commissioners, judges at the International Trade Commission that traveled over there and did just what Mark's talking about, and it did get results. So the question is, how are you going to get the countries engaged, and what departments are you going to get to engage in the discussion? Is it the State Department? They'll buy in, I think, if it's done right.
So there's been a lot of legwork that my colleagues especially have been doing, my co-authors, in fact. So yes, it takes a lot of persuasion and a lot of discussion among the various the interagency group that works on IP issues within the U.S. government. We've been talking to IP offices. We've been talking to governments at our first sort of test case dialogue we held in December. It was more of a discussion of how to discuss. We had nine nations represented. So we definitely, and that they tend to be more of the countries who already have a strong commitment to IP, and I think that's likely to be a good place to start. But of course, then it's necessary to bring others into the dialogue after you get those who are willing. And I agree that ultimately you have to engage the IP offices, I think, as you're saying, because they're the ones who have to understand and implement. But it also takes reaching out to the judiciary. It's a lot of work. This is a lot of detail work, and I guess I'll say that's I think what we're proposing in a way that it's perhaps I sold the problems with the current climate too hard, and my moderator has provided a stern correction. But I think there are things that you just can't do in trade agreements, and there are things like teaching judges how to protect secrets during litigation. And indeed, during our first session, one of our country representatives said, "I'd really like to have a presentation by the US FBI on investigating trade secret theft, criminal trade secret theft, because we have this provision, we've recently implemented it in our law, but we don't know how to do it. Our investigators don't know how to do it." So I think that's the kind of example of the detail work that I'm proposing, and I agree that it can work but needs to be done. So.
Just building on the question that was asked, two critical stakeholders to answer your question that I don't think were included in Mark's answer would be organizations like CPIP, right? I mean, it's that think tank to think tank, university to university collaboration and discussion that's critical in helping to plant the seed. The other key stakeholder group will be companies who recognize, domestic companies who recognize the value in protecting intellectual property rights to see their new innovations succeed in their home market.
Yeah, and I guess I failed to mention that, but indeed CPIP has a trade secret policy network, and we do meet on a biweekly basis, and it includes several trade association representatives and several company representatives, and we're always looking to involve more people interested in building this dialogue on trade secrets.
And just to add further to that, I think it's a very good question, and it often it points towards a sort of very unsexy part of what we're trying to ultimately get towards here. In terms of it takes a lot of legwork to do this, but it takes a measure of leadership for the US and others to sort of put it forward and to push it and to send that signal, and then for that signal to be returned. And I know it's something that we run into more broadly at ITIF because we focus on innovation policy, and sort of a growing number of policymakers sort of use it in their sort of rhetoric in economics. And so we often get a fair number of visiting sort of policymakers from around the world coming to us for ideas on it. So, which sort of lends to me in this case that if you do get something on trade secrets or something else like that, it sends a signal that others can then pick up on. And so, but it takes that leadership, that recognition that you need to commit the people and the time and the effort to do something that can just take a long time, but that you need to put it in the broader sort of strategy that you're looking at in terms of what are the various different ways we get to a better level of IP protection and enforcement. And having worked in government and sort of sat in these types of meetings and participated in far too many APEC meetings, as frustrated as I was at the time, I recognise that it's a critical component to sort of building the understanding so that you can get to a point to actually negotiate sort of the rules that ultimately we want. So it's not easy, requires a lot of legwork, but I think it's a part we're not doing obviously enough of, which thankfully Mark agrees with.
Mark, talk is cheap, but agreement is actually hard, right? And the problem that you see is that in a number of the different fora for the international negotiations, you reach stasis, particularly in WIPO, substantive law harmonization, differences over, issues relating to genetic resources, traditional knowledge. It doesn't go anywhere. So then you jump to another regime, and then you reach stasis there when disagreement occurs. So the question is, how do you get agreement rather than how do you get understanding? That would be really helpful to talk about. And one suggestion is free drinks. So who's going to pay for free drinks, right?
We'll make a note of that. Thank you. And it's a really good point, Josh.
I had one question for you, Becky. With respect to the White House, you mentioned the president's willingness to look at renegotiating trade agreements, and I saw the news this morning with respect to the Taiwanese antitrust decision. Is there anything that you can comment on with regards to how you see a way that you might have helped better protect corporate investments?
No comment.
Thanks. That's what I thought.
But it's one reason we have a nexus of IP antitrust panel tomorrow, though, is that this is indeed not just an issue in the U.S., but globally, as competition agencies are having a strong effect on businesses' availability to actually use their IP rights.
Any last question? All right. Well, I think we've had a great discussion on this issue. Just wanted to really, I hope you'll join me in giving a round of applause for our great panel.